check my, all right. Good evening. Welcome to the March 8th, 2022 Planning Commission meeting. I'd like to call the meeting to order. My name is Ken Beeson. I'm the chair of the Eugene Planning Commission. I want to thank everybody for joining us in this remote meeting format we're using in response to the pandemic. This enables the Planning Commission to meet, hear from the community, and take care of business while we're keeping the members, staff, public safe. Tonight, we're holding a public hearing on the Willamette Greenway Code amendments. They include proposed changes to the land use code. Anyone wishing to access and participate in the meeting could do so by following the access instructions. They're listed on the agenda for the meeting. The Planning Commission meetings can also be viewed by watching the live stream that's available on our website or the broadcast that's on Comcast Channel 21. If you wish to speak and provide testimony tonight, please know we will begin the testimony portion of tonight's meeting after an informational presentation from staff. When we reach that point, the staff will provide instructions about the virtual hearing format and how to participate. Before we start, I want to let you know a bit about the Planning Commission and our role in this process. First, we are unpaid volunteers. We're appointed by the Eugene City Council. We all live and work in Eugene, like many of you. For this Willamette Greenway Code Amendments project, we are not the decision makers. Rather, we will review the proposed amendments, the testimony, and the other relevant material before we begin our deliberation at subsequent meetings. We will then make a recommendation to the City Council. They will hold their own public hearing before making a final decision. We are at-large members. It means we have to consider the needs of the community as a whole, as well as the needs of all groups and neighborhoods. We're also human beings, which means that each one of us has personal views that make us who we are. But as planning commissioners, we're committed to balancing all of our needs as a community and to making the best recommendations we possibly can based on our policies, our laws, for us and for future generations. That can be pretty tough to do, and we know not everyone will agree with every recommendation we make. So as we proceed this evening, we want you to know upfront, we are listening, we care about you, we care about our community. We recognize how important the changes are. We encourage everyone speaking tonight to do so in a respectful and productive way. And even though we may or may not be able to do what you want, you will be heard. And we will strive to make the best recommendation possible. Before we start the hearing, I want to thank everyone again for your patience and your flexibility while we work within this virtual meeting format. As always, feel free to contact the staff if there's testimony you were not able to provide, or if you wish to provide to the planning, or you wish to provide to the Planning Commission in a different manner. For tonight's hearing, we're going to begin with a presentation from the staff, and then we will open the public hearing. So Gabe Flock will now begin the staff presentation on the Willamette Greenway Code amendments. So I'm going to turn it over to Gabe.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Chair Beeson, and good evening, Commissioners. So we thought it would be helpful to do a fairly detailed overview of the proposed Greenway Code amendments tonight in advance of the hearing. And tonight I have several project team members here with us: Jeff Gepper on city staff, Colin Mcarthur as our primary consultant helping to draft the proposal. And Lauren Summers is joining us tonight as well to help with some of the legal context. So Jeff, if you don't mind advancing the slide. So we're going to cover several topics, starting with some of the background about the Willamette Greenway, how our existing standards work, and some of the components of the new clear and objective standards and the process that is included in the draft code. Lauren will cover some of the legal context around the need for clear and objective standards. And then Colin will proceed with some of the background and the detail about the design plan the Greenway setback itself. And he's got some pretty good examples, I think, from the mapping work and some diagrams that will help us understand how the standards might work on a given site. And then I'll come back and talk a little bit about some of the key policy choices, topics that we expect that the Planning Commission will need to discuss and deliberate on following the public hearing. And we'll talk a little bit about next steps and go ahead and start the hearing. But I think in the interest of time and just to get started, I'll hand it over to Jeff.
Thank you, Gabe. Good evening, commissioners. Again, I'm Jeff Gepper, senior planner with the land use planning team. And my first thing I'm just going to mention today is looking at what is the Greenway. And so thinking about this really simply, the Greenway is everything that's covered within this blue boundary that you see here. I'll talk about how the Greenway was created and all that. But one thing I just want to get out of the way at the very beginning of this presentation is that the boundary of the Willamette Greenway that you see here is not proposed for change as part of this process. So this is going to be exactly the same as it is now on the other side of this project. So with that, I'm going to back up just a little bit and talk about where all this is coming from. So where the Greenway come from, how did we get here? And it all really started with the Oregon statewide planning goals. And so these are kind of the foundation of Oregon's land use system. And there's 19 of them. They range from anything from coastal planning to land use planning, forest lands, agriculture, citizen involvement. But really, we're going to be focusing on Goal 15. And Goal 15 is the Willamette Greenway. And that is really the impetus for this whole project and the reason why we're here tonight. But for a little bit of context, I'm actually going to jump and do a little detour over to Goal 5 because it provides some important context for what we're talking about tonight. Goal 5 is a pretty broad goal. It covers a lot of various different aspects, but one of the aspects that we're going to focus on is Goal 5 and natural resources. And so the city has regulations around natural resources that are directly associated with Goal 5. These are implemented through something that we call the Water Resource Conservation Overlay Zone. But really what that does is it provides protection measures for our identified Goal 5 resources. And this includes riparian resources, so things like rivers and streams. Here you can see, this is just one version of our Goal 5 map, but you can see in blue here, the Willamette River is one of our biggest Goal 5 riparian resources. And you can see here on the left that it's designated for protection and it has a 100-foot setback. So from the top of bank, there's a 100-foot setback. This is a setback that is often confused for what people consider to be the Willamette Greenway. And so within this setback, there's a very strict set of uses, regulations, and standards that apply in that area that strictly limit development to a specific set of uses that are either water dependent or permitted within that area, within that 100-foot conservation area. And the reason why I'm talking about this is because a lot of the measures that we're talking about in terms of doing the Willamette Greenway Code amendments is aligning the regulations that we have through our Goal 5 pieces through the Water Resources Zone and really aligning those with the Willamette Greenway measures. So making them kind of very similar in that way. So with that, I'll jump in at actual Goal 15. So Goal 15 was established with the other land use planning goals, and really in '76, we worked on creating the actual Willamette Greenway boundary. And so for those that remember, the Greenway boundary was officially done with these aerial maps that we have that have a little black line on them that clearly identify where the Willamette Greenway boundary is. And we have our modern kind of digital representations of those here. And within this Greenway boundary, basically any intensification of use is regulated and requires review under a Willamette Greenway permit. And currently, Willamette Greenway permits are processed under what we call a Type 3 land use application, which in planner speak doesn't mean a lot to many people, but what it does mean is that for any development proposal that's considered an intensification of use, which is a very specific definition, you have to go through a public hearing and you have to meet these standards that were set for that process and adopted into our local code. And those standards are based on the state's standards. And so really looking at the Greenway and the way that those Willamette Greenway permits are required, it presents some barriers to housing that have been identified. And one of those is that it applies regardless of the intensity of a housing project. So whether it's an apartment complex or a single family home on a lot, you're going to trigger the need for a Willamette River Greenway permit, a public hearing, the whole 9 yards. And then the other thing is that the regulations right now are lacking kind of a clear setback distance from the river. So this is kind of related to the next bullet, which says things are not clear and objective in the current process. And so between those two bullets, we can kind of identify that a lot of the Willamette Greenway regulations and standards that apply right now are very subjective. They contain language like to the maximum extent possible, or is something adequate, which enters into a level of discretion that is obviously not objective and leaves it open to interpretation. And the other thing that I would mention too is that the Willamette Greenway standards right now, they don't take into account the distance from the river. So in certain cases, you could be 1,200 feet away from the river and you still have to go through this exact same process as if you're right up against the river itself. And the biggest one, or the last bullet here, is really the fact that the existing Greenway standards in this process requires a public hearing. And so that's an additional time, cost, and burden that can present a barrier to housing development within our Greenway. And so one thing so our code amendments are really proposing to alleviate some of those barriers while still maintaining new standards that are consistent with the Goal 15 regulations and the Willamette Greenway boundary. And so the first thing is that the code amendments will create or really adopt the type 2 land use process that exists in our code already. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about that in a minute. It'll create a clear and objective set of approval criteria. So it'll get rid of that subjectivity. It includes a design plan as required by Goal 15. I'll talk about that in a little minute as well. And then it provides a mapped setback from the Willamette River, similar to how Goal 5 operates. And so one thing that I didn't really touch on that I meant to talk about earlier was that there's a perception that within the Willamette Greenway, so this whole blue area here, development is supposed to be precluded. That's oftentimes what people will say, is that no development is allowed in the Greenway, and it's not true. Development is allowed in the Greenway. It just has to be compatible with Goal 15 and the standards that it set forth. And so that's why we want to make sure that we have a very clear and objective set of standards that we can rely on to protect the really important resource that is the Willamette River. So under that first bullet, I talked about changing or providing a new permit procedure. And really this comes from the options that are allowed by Goal 15. So the statewide planning goal basically said that you have two options here to comply with the goal. You can either pretty much adopt the goal's compatibility standards and hold a public hearing for every time there's an intensification of use within the Willamette River Greenway. This is what we currently do. This is how we're currently applying this. However, the goal also set forward another option, which is to have an administrative review. So that would be a planning director level decision, which is how we're proposing it. As so long as you've adopted a design plan that demonstrates that your new standards and you've analyzed it accordingly to be consistent with Goal 15. So looking at where we are now, just for everybody's benefit, a type 3 process. So if you apply for development within the Willamette River Greenway now, this is where you're going. You submit an application, the application goes through the process, we send out public notice, and then we move on to the public hearing. So just like tonight, we have a public hearing. The only difference being is that it's held by our hearings official. And so that objective decision maker, she makes a decision based on the subjective Willamette Greenway criteria. And the decision either becomes final or goes to a local appeal, which would be to you, the Planning Commission. A good recent example would be the Lombard Apartments. So the new process that we're looking at is, and I say new process, this is a process we do every day. This is the process that partitions and subdivisions and site review, that's what those are subject to. So it would be allowing a type 2 process. So this is a planning director level decision. It also includes public notice. So there's an opportunity for public comment and public input. And then the planning director issues a decision and notice of that decision goes out. And then that can be appealed to the hearings official. So there's still opportunity for a local hearing to occur. And then after that, it would move on up the courts, just like any other land use decision would, or the decision becomes final. So the big difference that we would be proposing is that when you're proposing housing in the Greenway, you would have the opportunity to choose this type 2 process. And so that's really the next point here, is looking at what will happen to the existing standards. So we have this type 3 process, right? We're not proposing deleting it. That process will still exist. It will still apply to non-residential development that happens within the Greenway, or it'll apply to people who decide to choose that track for a housing project. So you can go with the general track for all development, which could be housing if you want it, or you could use the clear and objective track which is only available to housing. That's not available to non-residential uses. And so this would really resemble the other, as the Planning Commission is very familiar with, clear and objective processes that we've set forward, where we have a 2-track system where you can either choose the clear and objective path or the general track. And so as part of this process, we do have some new proposed standards. These would be the ones that are clear and objective. And Colin's going to talk about these at length a little bit more, but really it's looking at maximum length of buildings facades when they're within a certain distance of the Greenway setback area, parking area limitations, landscape standards, landscape buffer, access way standards, so public access standards that are clear and objective. And then lastly, that Greenway setback. And again, Colin's going to cover those in a little bit more detail later. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to Lauren to talk a little bit about the clear and objective approval criteria, why it's necessary, and why we're kind of engaged in this process.
Thanks, Jeff. Good evening, Planning Commission. Lauren Summers, Assistant City Attorney for the City of Eugene. As the Planning Commission is well aware, there is the City of Eugene and other cities with lands within the Greenway are currently caught between 2 competing state law directives. You have the requirement to provide clear and objective standards for all housing, and then you have the Greenway standards, which are inherently subjective. And just to kind of remind you of the background and the way that we got into this situation, up until just a few years ago, there wasn't inconsistency between the clear and objective requirement and Goal 15 requirements, because the way the clear and objective statute used to read was that clear and objective standards were required for needed housing on buildable lands, and buildable lands were defined to exclude certain lands that were encumbered by goal protective measures, including Goal 15. So the Greenway was not considered to be buildable land, and there was no requirement for clear and objective standards for housing within the Greenway. However, a few years ago, the legislature adopted Senate Bill 1051, which amended the clear and objective requirement to take out the reference to buildable lands and to say that clear and objective standards are required for all housing. And so now we are in a situation where, on the one hand, we have this direction from the state to provide a clear and objective track for all housing developed anywhere. And on the other hand, we have the requirements of Goal 15 that says things like, to the greatest possible degree, the maximum possible landscaped area, et cetera. Those are not clear and objective standards. So up until Senate Bill 1051, the way that the city of Eugene handled Greenway permit applications was fine because we just imported the standards from Goal 15 into our code. And it didn't matter that they were subjective because Greenway properties were excluded from the clear and objective requirement. But now we have this requirement to provide clear and objective standards for all housing, no matter where it is developed. And so this project is the city's attempt to create a set of clear and objective standards for housing in the Greenway that also comply with Goal 15's requirements to the greatest possible degree, provide the maximum possible landscaped area, open space, or vegetation between the activity, the development, and the river. So as Jeff mentioned, Goal 15 allows for this creation of an administrative review process and a design plan. And so the city is proceeding under those procedures for development of these clear and objective standards, and have put together a design plan, which Colin will talk in depth about in just a moment, that supports the proposed clear and objective criteria and shows that a housing development that chooses to comply with the list of clear and objective criteria adopted by the city will comply with the requirements of Goal 15. And so an individualized public hearing isn't required, but the type 2 process that's being proposed does still provide the opportunity for the public to weigh in and provide written comment, provides for a local appeal, and all of that. So I think, unless the commission has any questions, I think that's my kind of quick spiel about clear and objective versus the Greenway. In terms of this project's relationship to the Middle Housing Code amendments, as the commission may remember, the Oregon administrative rules that implement House Bill 2001, the minimum standards, include some requirements about middle housing within the Greenway specifically, and say basically that middle housing to be developed within the Greenway has to have access to clear and objective standards. And so there is a correlation between this project and the Middle Housing Code amendments, but the clear and objective standards that are being proposed for the Greenway, if adopted by the City Council, would apply to all housing, not just middle housing within the Greenway. So anyone wanting to develop housing within the Greenway would have the option of proceeding under this new, effectively clear and objective track, or they could, just like they can with PUDs and other land use application types of the City of Eugene, choose instead the current Willamette Greenway permit procedures and approval criteria, which are subjective, but more flexible than the clear and objective criteria. So we're just effectively developing a 2-track system that's similar to many of our application types. And with that, I will pass it over to Colin for an explanation of the design plan.
Yeah, thank you, Lauren and Jeff, for all the helpful background. Good evening, planning commissioners. I am Colin Mcarthur, principal planner with Cameron McCarthy Landscape Architecture and Planning here in Eugene. And we have been working for the city on the technical components of this project. And the primary components are the design plan, which Lauren mentioned, and the Willamette Greenway Code amendments that establish the review process for housing using the clear and objective track. I'll talk about the design plan first. And so again, this track involves this design plan and then an administrative review procedure. The design plan itself is a supporting document and the foundation for the code changes. It establishes the basis and the tools to be used for the review of housing in the Greenway. And the document itself includes really the summary and purpose need for the amendments, a history of Eugene's work to protect the Greenway over time, methodology for the establishment of tools, setback lines, and top of bank determination, which again only apply to the review of housing in the Greenway, and then findings required by state law showing how the plan and code changes will continue to protect open space and vegetation and provide for public access along the river. We did a lot of research as part of the design plan and included in the design plan. And Jeff, I'll ask you to advance the slides. Thank you. This first map shows parks, natural areas, and open space within the Greenway. And we found that there are 1,782 total acres of land within the Greenway. Of this, 782 are parkland, city-owned parkland within the Greenway, and that 44% of the Greenway is in public parks, natural areas, or open space. And then within this, there's also 25.8 miles of bike path. If we take this a step further and look, not shown on this map, look at total public land ownership, and that would include federal, state, school district, transportation, right-of-way. The findings in the design plan show that 88% of the Greenway is in a form of public ownership, meaning that only 12% is private. Next thing we looked at was river access. And this map shows an inventory of public access points to the river. And this shows that there are 28 river access points that provide opportunities for boat and paddlecraft launch, fishing, wading, wildlife viewing, and scenic viewpoints all along the river and along the Greenway. Looking more specifically at public access in general, and that is the next slide, Jeff, we found that there are in total 58 points of public access along the Greenway, and this is a point where existing right-of-way intersects with a connection to the Greenway, like a multi-use path connection or a sidewalk leading to the Greenway. 58 of those points, and then in addition, there are 6 bridge crossings of the river within the Greenway. Getting a little more into the tools that we're proposing in the design plan. Now I'll talk about the proposed setback. So we do propose a 100-foot setback from the top of bank to keep structures separated from the river and to protect vegetation and open space along the Greenway. And this 100-foot measurement was selected in part to be consistent with the Goal 5 water resource setback distance. And I'll talk a little bit more about the process we went through to determine top of bank and then to determine the setback. So in order to apply the setback, we had to establish a horizontal line. Top of bank was selected as the horizontal boundary from which to apply the setback. And this is primarily because both state law and the Eugene code define top of bank and have a essentially built-in definition. However, there is currently no digitized or map top of bank line in existence for Eugene, which means that individual developments would have to define that themselves as part of the process. So the design plan sets out to establish a digitized top of bank for use in this review process. And this line is based on LIDAR from the Oregon Department of Geologic and Mineral Industries that was processed by LCOG first and then was provided to the city of Eugene. This data has a relative accuracy of 0.163 feet or 2 inches. And then when city of Eugene got it, they estimated the top of bank line using several data sets within or several layer sets, excuse me, within this data. And those included 2-foot contour, slope, and hill shade layers. We took it a step further, and once city provided us this data, we field verified the line at 6 test sites where we collected GPS survey points on a handheld GPS unit and compared that to the digitized line, and did find that it was very accurate. So once we established top of bank line, we used that to apply the 100-foot setback. And again, 100-foot was selected because it's consistent with goal 5 primarily. I will note there are 2 exceptions where the setback is not 100 feet. And we made a policy choice to exempt developed residentially zoned properties from the proposed setbacks. And then for areas where there is already an established greenway setback, and there are 2 refinement plans and 1 special area plan that have established setbacks, we acknowledge those setbacks, and the setbacks default to those measurements in those locations. Again, these are policy choices that we made as part of the process, and expect that there will be some discussion and deliberation at this level about those choices. I do have a few slides that sort of illustrate how the setback works, and apologies, these are a little washed out, the colors, so they may be a little hard to read. And these are from the city's GIS mapping system, but this shows a typical application of a greenway setback where the top of bank has been digitized. That's the green line. Thank you for following that with your cursor, Jeff. The red line is the proposed 100-foot setback, which is a standard offset, no exceptions, no adjustments here from the top of bank. And then the shaded green area is the greenway itself, greenway boundary, and then you can pick up the riverfront bike path. So this is an area that would be subject to the new standards if it were developed as housing. Next slide is an area that has an established greenway setback line, and this is specifically the Downtown Riverfront special area plan, in which a setback was established as part of the ordinance and greenway permit. And this happens to be a variable setback, and it was drawn intentionally to encompass the planned riverfront park, which has now been constructed, and to exclude development that was already very close to the river, such as the steam plant. So you'll see the green top of bank line, and then how the red setback sort of jogs and moves inland once it gets past the steam plant and substation, and then eventually goes back to 100 feet. But again, this was established by ordinance as part of that special area plan, and we are acknowledging it or incorporating it into the setback proposed for as part of this project. Another area is this is the Willa Kinsey area plan, which is along the north side of the river, and that is an adopted refinement plan, which has an adopted 35-foot setback. And this shows some existing development that's a little bit north on the north bank, north of Ferry Street Bridge, where the adopted setback is set at 35 feet from the river, which is right at the edge of the existing development. So within the Willa Kinsey area plan, we are again defaulting to the adopted setback, which is 35 feet. And then I think the final exception area I'll show you is This is an area that we chose to exclude from the setback because it is prior developed residential. And if you can see the green and red lines in the middle of the screen, that's actually a city-owned park property where the setback would be set at 100 feet. As you move north of that, if we were to offset the setback 100 feet, and there's a really faint dotted orange line that probably isn't really visible, but if we were to set the setback at 100 feet, it would be on top of some existing residential development and encompass all of that development. And there are several areas along the river where we documented this condition. Again, we made a policy choice to exclude developed residential properties from the setback. And again, this shows an example of where that policy choice was applied. Next, I want to get into the proposed code standards, and these establish the clear and objective track for review of housing in the Greenway. The standards generally focus on maximum length of building facade next to the Greenway, parking area limitations, some requirements for landscape standards and buffering and planting, access requirements, and then how the Greenway setback itself works. So we've got a few graphics that illustrate how the code standards work. This is an example site plan that shows a hypothetical 3-unit housing development that is proposed to occur in the Greenway. And so in this instance, the setback is measured from top of bank, and it is set at 100 feet. And that's what's shown in the gray shaded area. The setback prohibits structures. So structural structures are not allowed within the setback. So they have to be outside the setback. A depicts a code standard that limits the length of the building facade to 80 feet within 40 feet of the setback line. So this is a massing standard that's trying to control a mass of buildings that are super close to the Greenway setback. Keynotes B and C show a required 10-foot landscape area that is required along the setback that must be planted with native plants. So in addition to the 100 feet, there's an additional 10-foot setback. D, standard D, prohibits fences and walls within the setback. E does allow fences within the landscape area so long as they are 50% transparent, so as to preserve some visibility through and along the Greenway. Standard F prohibits parking and vehicle use areas between the building and the setback. So they must be behind the building or on the side of the building. They can't be between the building and the setback. And then as shown here, G requires a private access connection or private pedestrian connection from main building entrances to the edge of the development site nearest to the river. And there is one other standard I'll point out that's not depicted in this graphic, and there is a additional public access standard not shown that does require a public access connection through or along the site where housing development is located more than 500 feet from one of the access points I showed previously on the public access map. And this is to allow for the city, or give the city a tool to provide for public access and require public access where public access does not currently exist within 500 feet. And then 2 more graphics. Next one is just a cross section that illustrates the relationship between the river, top of bank, property line, Greenway setback, and where the proposed development would land. And then keynote A, back to that one in a second, shows the setback. And then B is the well, A is a landscape setback, B is a greenway setback, and both of those must be planted with native plant species. And then finally, the last one is a three-dimensional axonometric diagram that illustrates essentially the same relationship in different form. And this one does show a little fence within the setback that is partly transparent, but you can see how the top of bank setback, greenway setback, landscape setback, and then public access connections work. And with that, that covers my content, and I will turn it back to Gabe for discussion of some policy choices.
All right, thanks, Colin. Yeah, so as we develop these code amendments and the design plan, we recognize there's going to be several kind of key policy choices and other topics that we wanted to highlight, well in advance of deliberations, partly based on testimony as well. Colin touched on some of those with the maps in regards to some exceptions for existing developed residential properties. And we'll want to bring that topic back to consider whether or not and what the implications might be of establishing the setback at the full 100 feet as is proposed otherwise. There are several areas in town that have existing adopted setbacks, which Colin also mentioned. One of those is the Willa Kinsey area plan along the north side of the river, which has an adopted setback of 35 feet. The Riverfront Park study near and including part of the campus for University of Oregon also has a codified 35-foot setback. And the other exception relates to a pretty recent adoption of a custom setback, which is mainly related to the extensive prior developed area on the Downtown Riverfront site. So we, coming into this process, made a call, if you will, in drafting the amendments to honor those and carry those existing adopted setbacks into this draft code. We expect that there'll be more discussion about that, and again, the implications of that. A variety of other possible mapping refinements we expect to occur, and in terms of the ongoing process, we've heard from a few folks about specific properties that we intend to look at more closely. We will bring back some of those options and what we found with regard to individual properties in certain areas. And then I think another key issue has to do with the way that, and the relatively simple set of clear and objective standards. I mean, part of the intent is to streamline this process with clarity, right? But the way the code is drafted now, it really relies on the existing base zone standards for development within the Greenway. That's already how it works with the Type 3 Willamette Greenway permit process. And we've heard testimony that we'd like to address in more detail as to whether or not certain housing types or other development should be regulated differently with regard to building height or other standards that typically carry with the base zone. What we've proposed are what we believe to be bona fide Goal 15 related protections related to the sort of the spatial relationship to the river, things like the native landscape buffering and the distance, and really about the scenic qualities of the river and that relationship. And it would certainly be more complex if we were to dive into some of those customized standards. Another topic that's come up, and I thought it would be helpful and maybe reassuring to folks, is to talk a little bit about existing Greenway permit approvals. So the question has come up about whether or not certain projects might become legal nonconforming as a result of these proposed amendments. And I think it's important to highlight the fact that anyone with a vested existing approved Greenway permit will certainly be able to carry forward and develop according to that permit approval. And in terms of the proposed amendments themselves, they only will apply in the event that an applicant chooses to take on the Type 2 process through the clear and objective standards. And so in that instance, where an applicant chooses the type 2 process and is proposing housing, they would be subject to the new standards and the 100-foot setback. Short of that, they have the option to undertake the type 3 process, which, as was discussed, continues to rely on the subjective standards that we have in code now. Excuse me. And so what about mixed use? It's a question that's come up from a number of folks in the process, and staff's also looked at that a little more closely with our own legal counsel. And I think just to put a finer point on it, and we want to discuss this more with the commission, is that a proposal that includes housing will be able to avail itself of this new process. The fact that it may include a commercial component or some other use, so long as it includes housing, we believe that it will be able to take on or to avail itself of this new process. So we'll bring back more information on all of these topics, and just wanted to highlight a few of those. We expect there'll be more that come up in testimony as well. So in terms of next steps, we will have the public hearing tonight. And we are recommending that the commission keep the record open for at least a week, which would be until March 15th, to allow for additional testimony and sort of a soft close of the record, so that the Planning Commission will have a discrete set of information to rely on in making your recommendation. And so those deliberations are at least scheduled at this point for the 22nd and 29th later this month. And we hope to get a recommendation from the Planning Commission in time for proposed date at City Council. It's tentatively on their schedule, I believe, for April 18th. And the goal is to hopefully have these amendments in place along with the middle housing adoption package before the end of June. So with that, I'll turn it back to Jeff, and we'll talk a little bit more about input and get on with the public hearing.
Thanks, Gabe. Yeah, so anybody who is interested in submitting testimony or written comment regarding obviously you have the opportunity to speak tonight, but you can also submit, if you want to submit more detail, written comments to Greenway testimony at eugene-or.gov. You can write our commissioners also directly there. I always recommend CCing the testimony link at the top. And then finally, as Gabe just mentioned, the Planning Commission will review materials if they agree with the March 15th date, up at that stuff that's received up until that point. After that, any other materials will be provided to the City Council for their consideration. And so one thing I would also suggest is if you are looking for more information on this, the project webpage has a lot more information. That's eugene-or.gov/code amendments. So I'm gonna take off the presentation hat and put on the moderator hat at this point in the hearing and talk a little bit about the process tonight. So obviously, Chair Beeson opened our meeting earlier. We're finally wrapping up the staff presentation here. And so we'll shortly be opening up the public hearing. So this is a good time for anybody who is interested in speaking tonight to raise your virtual hand. And you can do that by, if you're joining us on a smart device, computer, tablet, phone, or so on, you can do that by clicking the raise hand button, which is in your menu or oftentimes just at the bottom of your screen. If you're joining in by phone, you can do so by dialing *9 and you're getting audio confirmation. I will provide a little bit more detail on providing testimony, what you need to do in order to do that in a little bit, but just looking at this, after we hear the testimony, the public hearing will be closed. We'll go on to discuss the close of the record and then potentially adjourn. So with that, I will hand it back to Chair Beeson and stop sharing my screen.
Thank you. Thank you to everybody for the information. So what I'd like to do now is open the public hearing. As the staff has just presented and talked to you about, if you would like to speak, if you haven't already raised your hand, please raise your virtual hand now to get yourself into the queue. The testimony that's presented at the public hearing should be directed towards the applicable approval criteria or other criteria that the speaker believes applies to the decision. The applicable approval criteria for proposed land use code amendments are from Eugene Code section 9.8065. And in general terms, the approval criteria require that the proposed changes are consistent with the applicable statewide planning goals, the comprehensive plan, the metro plan, and the adopted refinement plans. So with that, I'm going to ask Jeff, how many speakers do we have in the queue right now?
We have 5 in the queue at the moment.
Okay. I think we'll go ahead and proceed. And based on the number of speakers that we have, we're going to allow each speaker 3 minutes to speak. We also encourage you to submit written testimony that you have, as well as speaking. We're interested in all the testimony. So I think what we'll do, I'll just hand it back to Jeff to go ahead and we'll proceed with the testimony.
Great, thank you, Commissioner. So just for a little bit more housekeeping on providing testimony this evening, again, if you want to raise your virtual hand, you can do so by clicking the raise hand button or dialing *9 if you're joining on phone. When going through this process, what's going to happen is I'm going to announce whose turn it is to speak, and I'll also announce who's on deck. Now, when I announce that you're on deck, you'll be brought into our group as a panelist, which means you'll have the option to turn on your video and unmute at that time to provide your testimony. Once you begin providing your testimony, you'll have 3 minutes, as Chair Beeson just described. When you hit the 30-second mark, I will wave a little fun flyer that says 30 seconds left, just to let you know. And then at that time, if you do go over the time limit, I will stop your ability to speak and move on to the next speaker at that time. Please wait to turn on your video and unmute until the person before you has concluded their testimony and your name has been called. And finally, when it is your time to speak, remember to begin by stating your name and address clearly. That way we can have it in the record. And just as a reminder to everybody that tonight's meeting is being recorded. So with that, I'm going to announce that. So I've got Maya and Bill. Oh, I'm sorry. I've got Louisa is the first speaker in line. And then after that, I have Maya. I'm sorry if I pronounce people's names incorrectly. Please forgive me. So I have Louisa, you can begin your testimony when you are ready.
Woo. Good evening, commissioners. My name is Louisa DeHeer. I am a current City of Eugene Sustainability Commissioner, as well as a member of the Community Advisory Committee for the River Road Santa Clara Neighborhood Plan. And I'm here tonight kind of representing that 5 years of developed input from our community members. A lot of the Willamette Greenway is in River Road. And we're really thinking about how we want our neighborhood to develop. And we're looking at these opportunities that are being presented and also some of the challenges. And I just wanted to share some notes from the conversation and the sharing from Cameron McCarthy and the staff tonight. After also working with Chris Ramey on the development for the riverfront at U of O, we noticed that a lot of the top of bank in the Willamette is actually artificial via dumping over the years and riprap, and is not the natural river flow. The riverfront at EWEB also worked with layback to address the fact that the natural riparian zone is not necessarily the top of the bank. Those two are not necessarily connected and should be thought further about in terms of the health of the subterranean water flow. I also appreciate that the staff addressed the Greenway setback overlap with the Goal 5 significant riparian corridors, which are not necessarily the same lines. And on the mapping overlays, you can see places where, in fact, the Goal 5 significant riparian corridor is greater than the 100-foot setback. And I think that for the sake of the river and the health of the river, The setback should extend to the boundary of the Goal 5 significant riparian corridor or the 100-foot setback, whichever is greater. For the new development in the Greenway, the buffer between the property line and the setback should have an environmental impact statement for the existing canopy, for the protecting of those canopy species, where we have healthy trees in that space, which is in the buffer setback area. Those should be required to be assessed for protection, because once the canopy is gone, you can't just bring it back. It takes many, many, many years. Formal and paved private access from the river across the Greenway should be prohibited. We don't want people to use public property in those areas as private access locations. And I do think that where there are existing residential buildings within the 100-foot setback in violation of Goal 5, as were noted in the presentation, like on Cropping, Hatton, Mary, Greenleaf, and other streets, those properties should not receive a building permit for any development that gets any closer to the river than the existing building. Nor can those properties where the majority of the property is within the 100-foot setback be redeveloped to a higher density at any point. Those would be logical ways to allow for the kind of the goal and the intention of, I think, the Willamette Greenway, by allowing existing properties to have the setback.
Sorry to cut you off, Louisa. Thank you for your testimony. Next, we have Maya is up next. Maya, you can begin when you are ready. And following Maya, we will have, let's see who's next in line, Bill Close.
Oh, hi. We recently can you hear me?
Sounds good.
Okay. We recently, I'm Maya Sestide, and I live at 505 River Road. And we recently discovered on the map that the property that we have is going to benefit from this proposal, because it appears that you're going to take the Greenway setback off of our property and move it to our fence. Now, our fence is only 8 feet away from the bike path. So I'm kind of hoping this isn't true. So we have some questions, because this is the worst case scenario of what this proposal could do to Eugene. So our property is in the 100-year flood zone. And we learned several years ago that no federal dollars will come in and finance low-income housing in a floodplain. So our question, is it okay that we just build market rate apartments on our property? And with this freed up land, I saw that we might be able to build a lot of units on the property. We have 2.8 acres. And the property used to be in a nodal zone, which it still might be in a nodal zone. And we were limited to 72 units. But it's possible that it looks like we might be able to get 125 or more, according to what I read about this proposal. So, and is it possible that all of these buildings on our 2.8 acres, can they be 3 stories high, 42 feet high, so that we can maximize the units? And could 24 of those units just be 5 feet away from the fence, making it only 13 feet away from the bike path? And we have a lot of trees on our 2.8 acres, more than 200. And your proposal does not protect trees. So would it be okay with the city that we cut down one of the biggest and oldest white walnut trees in the city? And do we have to replace the 200 trees that we destroy in this process? So I don't support this new thing, especially if our property is the example of what's going to happen to Eugene and the Greenway. We'd like you to keep the Greenway the way it is, protected on these private properties with the setbacks. Don't take them away.
Thank you for your testimony. The time has expired at this point. Bill Close, you can begin your testimony whenever you are ready. I'll note that you will have to unmute. And following Bill, we will have Phil Farrington.
Okay, thanks folks, hope you can hear me. You have a 5-page letter from me, which I gave to staff this morning. It gets into the gory detail. I've only got 3 minutes here. So I'll just hit some high points. I know staff will get to it and you will too. My letter was written on my own behalf. I'm speaking on my own behalf tonight, as you can tell, because I'm not wearing a tie. But I have got several clients who ultimately will show up, who have a big stake in this. The biggest question for me is, why do we need to do this? My first point raises the issue that for the past 6 years, whenever we do a housing project in the Greenway, staff and city attorney weigh in and say, we have to have, by state law, we have to have only discretionary standards in the Greenway. You can't get clear and objective standards. And that was as recently as November 21st of 2021. And so I included that city attorney opinion along with a lot of attachments that show that the issue's been slogged through for years, including by the hearings official and by the planning commission. And all of a sudden now, it's okay that we have clear and objective standards. So what's up? You know, are we wrong now? And we shouldn't be we don't have to have clear and objective standards, or has the city been wrong for the past 6 years? And we didn't need to have discretionary standards back then. This really needs to be sorted out. Plenty of time to do that. The second issue, probably the last one I'm going to touch on in my 3 minutes here, is the question of how do you draw the line? It looks to me like the preferred methodology right now is to use LiDAR to figure out where the top of bank is, and then draw off 100 feet and adopt a map that shows 100 feet. I think that's a big mistake because there are going to be arguments when somebody comes in to file an application for actually developed property. That person's going to come in with a surveyed site plan. And then the question is going to be, how do you stretch and pull and expand the official map to fit that survey? It's not going to work. It's never worked in the past. It's not going to work in the future. I think you'd be much better served to use the same methodology as was used in the Goal 5 process. You define your starting points, top of bank, 30 seconds, and then you drop off, not hard to find the top of bank, good working definition. And then your surveyor comes in with a site plan and draws back 100 feet, and that becomes a meets and bounds line on the site plan. There are other methods too, but I think this is probably the second major issue in the whole program here. I'm almost out of time. I want to end with 5 seconds left. Thank you very much for hearing me out. Look forward to future hearings on this. Bye-bye.
Well done in timing. Phil, you're up next. You can begin when you're ready, and following Phil will be Elizabeth Holmes.
Thank you, commissioners, for accepting testimony tonight. My name is Phil Farrington. I work as the Real Estate Development Director for CDC Management Corp. We're developing a project that's touched by the Greenway. We received Greenway approval for a project that is on Garden Avenue in the Walnut Station Special Area Zone. So my comments are particular to these properties that are owned in the Special Area Zone. It's an oddity because properties are partly within the Greenway by virtue of their location, at least partly bisected by the mill race, but then further bisected from the river by the Union Pacific Railroad tracks. My concern initially was that the Crosswood project, which is under construction now, would be subject to these standards or perhaps be deemed non-conforming. So I'm really gratified to hear, Gabe, you mentioned so clearly that prior approval that we secured is not in jeopardy. I do, however, have some lingering concern about the location of the setback boundary that's identified, or the 100-foot setback from the river. When we went through the Greenway permit process, we indicated that it was more than 100 feet from the river or top of bank. to the corner of the property boundary. I want to make sure, though, that there's no issue of nonconformity with the fencing that occurs all the way along private property on the south side of the UPRR tracks in the Walnut Station Special Area Zone, including on this developed property. We have property next door that we may develop in the future. Again, would be left with the same issue where we develop the housing component likely outside of the Greenway, fronting onto Garden Avenue, as the Walnut Station Special Area Zone form-based code standards require us to do. But part of the property will still be within the Greenway, and we may be subject to Greenway standards. If we were to try and avail ourselves of this clear and objective type 2 process, then the location of that setback is very fundamentally key. What we think is that the existing language that's in the code 9.4920 sub 6, which states that subject to the goal 5 boundaries, that when an existing developed street physically isolates a portion of the conservation setback area from the resource site, that isolated portion of the conservation area shall be excluded from the conservation area. This is the same kind of thing where you can consider this railroad to be analogous to a street, or it's not going anywhere. So any kind of requirements to relocate a fence further on this private property away from the tracks, just because of the that setback boundary, which I think is an error, is really not going to do any ecological benefit to the Greenway itself. So I'd encourage you to just look at this special area zone properties as a bit of a.
I'm sorry to cut you off, Phil. Thank you for your testimony. And so up next, we have Elizabeth Holmes, followed by the last person to have their hand raised, which is Drew. And Drew, or I'll just say for anybody else that's interested in speaking tonight, you can do so by getting in the line, by raising your virtual hand. You can do that by dialing *9 if you're joining by phone, or by clicking the raise hand button if you're on a smart device or a tablet. So Elizabeth, whenever you are ready.
Good evening. My name is Elizabeth Holmes. I'm the staff attorney for Willamette Riverkeeper. We work up and down the 187 miles of the Willamette River and are concerned about the river, riparian areas, and the ecosystem, and obviously pollution that gets into the river. Thanks for the opportunity for public comment, both in written format and in oral format for everyone. I wanted to just comment, in addition to the letter that we sent in on February 28th, I wanted to highlight just a couple portions of that letter, mostly focusing on the transition that's proposed from the type 3 to type 2 process, even though it is an option. We believe that providing that streamlined process to type 2 is something that could be easier for the city and easier for developers, but might come at a cost to the public. It essentially can eliminate the public checks and balances of the city's approval process, and it doesn't appear that there is a mitigation for the loss of that right that the public has with respect to notice and comment on proposed projects. That's important because, as I'm sure you're hearing from other groups interested in this, public housing is clearly a controversial issue in our area. And in that case, there would be a need for more procedural rights, not less. I just want to comment briefly on the clear and objective focus area. We are worried that that would risk becoming simply a box checking exercise. We've seen that happen in a number of other situations, not with respect to Greenway amendments, but in like the land use compatibility statement context. We've seen that happen in a lot of places where literally applications have been submitted and approved within an hour, which really makes us question the analysis and consideration that's being done of the information that's being provided. And so we're concerned about how really clearly that the clear and objective standards tie in and dovetails with Goal 5, Goal 15 requirements to protect, conserve, and enhance the Willamette River Greenway. And last way, with respect to pollution, we are concerned about stormwater pollution that would be generated by increased construction in the Willamette Greenway and how that is proposed to be managed either by regulations or in the plan design standards that are being provided. Thanks very much for your time this evening.
Thank you. And so up next we have Drew, and with that, I don't have anybody else in the queue for providing public testimony this evening.
Hello, my name is Drew Simran. Thank you for allowing me to testify this evening. I live off of the River Road in Eugene, and I've seen a few of the developments that have been coming in and that are requiring those Greenway permits. I only recently was made aware of this meeting, actually maybe about a half hour ago, so I kind of skimmed through the proposed code amendments. So I'll be looking through and probably submitting extra testimony via email, but I did notice one thing about the amendments for notice of application for notifying community members. I noticed that when I was riding on the bike path, there's been some signs when Willamette Greenway permits are to be issued, but I feel like that needs to be added as an amendment for how, like, it says that, you know, residents will be mailed that are nearby, from what I understand, for the public hearing notice. And I think that it should be required that signage also be put up on streets and along the bike path where applicable, where people walk through, because the Greenway, you know, many people access that. And I attended a hearing on one of the permits, and I noticed they had mentioned that they weren't required to put out the signage on the bike path. So I do think that it's important that that be captured and added, so that those that are on the Greenway, enjoying the Greenway, are also made aware of the changes, and not just those that live in the immediate area, because there's people, you know, from all around the county that come and ride the awesome bike paths that we have here in Eugene. So I'll be reading through some of the rest of this and providing additional testimony, but thank you. That's all I have this evening.
Thank you. And with that, I just will make a final call to see if anybody else is going to raise their hand to provide testimony, but I do not see anybody in the queue at this point. So with that, I will hand it back to you, Chair Beeson.
Okay, good. And first off, thank you to everyone. Thanks for taking time out of your evening, and thanks for sharing with us your thoughts on this. So at this point, the public hearing is now closed. Let's see here. The staff is recommending that the Planning Commission continue to accept written testimony on the Willamette Greenway code amendments for 1 week following the public hearing tonight. And that would specifically be until 5 p.m. March 15th, 2022. And then written testimony received after that date will not be considered by the Planning Commission, but it will be provided to the City Council for their consideration as they continue in the review process. So I guess with that, I'd be looking to the Commission for if there are any questions or discussion on that, keeping the process open for 1 week and or maybe getting a motion. Hang on here, let me see. Okay, I've got Commissioner Edwards.
I have two questions. Thank you, Chair
Mm-hmm.
Beeson. My first question is, do you need a motion for that? And then my second question is, if we have some technical questions of staff primarily, just based on presentation, I would just be curious to know when you would like to have those questions.
Okay.
You need a motion?
We do need a motion and a second on this, and we will. Like what we'll do once we do this, I'm going to see if the staff has any kind of comments back on any of the testimony, and then open it up to the commissioners to see if you have any comments or questions, and we'll kind of take it that way if that's all right. So we'd like to address this, keeping the record open at this point.
I'm happy to make that motion. So moved.
I'll second that.
Okay.
Okay, it's moved and seconded to keep the record open to accept written testimony on the Willamette Greenway Code amendments for 1 week from tonight, specifically till 5 p.m. on March 15th, 2022. So I guess I'll ask, is there any other question about that in particular? There isn't. I guess I'll ask for a show of hands on from the commission on who supports that. Okay, I'm seeing a unanimous support, so we've got that. What I'd like to do now, so at this point, I think what I'd like to do, if this works, is, like I just said a minute ago, I think what I'd like to do is offer the staff, initially the staff, a chance to offer response to testimony that's been offered this evening, and then open it up to the commissioners. So maybe I'll ask Gabe and Jeff and others if they have a staff response to any testimony.
Thanks, Chair Beeson. I appreciate the opportunity to respond and want to thank everybody that took the time tonight to come testify. I know we've received a fair amount of written testimony, and I also appreciate that folks will have an opportunity for an additional week to do so. In terms of some initial responses, I think first I'd like to turn to other project team members and see if there are any specific issues brought up tonight that you might want to respond to. We will have and intend to provide some more in-depth written responses to some of the issues raised here, but I'll at least note at the outset that in terms of the mapping work, that we will be doing some investigation of individual sites and looking at some of those refinements. As I mentioned earlier, we'll be bringing back some of those key issues for discussion. And in terms of the timing and why now, I think it's important to point out that this project for the code amendments within the Greenway was something that was out of the scope of the clear and objective adoption package that the city passed last year. And we've recognized for some time as applied through individual land use applications, Greenway permits. You've seen some appeals yourselves, and there is this kind of ongoing conflict, if you will, with regard to the inherent subjective nature of the criteria that we have to use under the type 3 process. And so we've recognized for some time that it's an overall community objective, and one that staff recognizes firsthand in these these particular development cases that have come forward, that we really want to have a clear and objective option, and I believe legally we are required to do so. And it's just really been a matter of capacity and timing that it's taken some time to get the proposals together and bring it forward. So with that, I'll see if any other staff members have anything to respond to, and maybe Commissioner Jeff, excuse me.
I'll just really quickly, there were some comments tonight that were focused on the middle housing code amendments, and I will just reference that as a different process from the Willamette Greenway code amendments that we're talking about tonight. So if you're curious about learning more about the middle housing code amendments, you can reach out to me. My email is just jgepper, that's my last name, is Gepper, at eugene-or.gov. I'm happy to answer middle housing questions, or you can go to eugene-or.gov/middle housing to get more information there. So I strongly encourage you, if you're interested in those amendments, to look in there. And I think that'll conclude my statements at this point.
If I can quickly add two things, Gabe, or to maybe three things. I want to clarify first the nature of the setback, Greenway setback itself. There was some commentary about potentially removing a setback, and I want to make it clear that that is not the case. The Greenway boundary has been established and has been in place since late 70s, early 80s, and a typical process when someone would go through a type 3 process to obtain a Greenway permit, they would also establish a setback as part of that process. In this case, as part of these amendments, we are establishing or attempting to establish a setback citywide to be used for the type 2 administrative, clear, and objective process. So we're essentially adding a setback, and that action does not affect the setback that has already been established for water resources and goal 5, and is in fact an attempt to make those setbacks consistent with the areas that we talked about where there are exceptions. And we believe that action of establishing a setback makes it removes a barrier to development going through the administrative review process. Second part is, you alluded to this, Gabe, there were 6 sites we field tested as part of our verification of top of bank and setback. We did not look at the site south bank of the river by the Union Pacific Railroad tracks. We are doing some investigation of that and potentially some other sites to make sure that we've got all areas where there may be some nuances in the setback covered, but those field investigations will continue, and we'll provide that information back to Planning Commission.
Okay. I think I'm gonna switch it over. I'm gonna call on Commissioner Ramey. I bypassed you a minute ago. You had your hand up, and I think I didn't mean to do that. So I'm gonna call on you, and then Commissioner Edwards.
That's okay. Commissioner Edwards, did you have something quick that was related to something that just happened, or no? Okay. So I have about, maybe 10 things here, and I'm going to try to group some of them. So I may just do like 2 or 3 and then let other people talk and reorganize my thoughts possibly. So the first one was about, why we're, thank you, Commissioner Edwards, why we're doing this now. And, as a layperson, I've struggled with this sometimes, but my understanding is that we can use this idea of a plan to help us create a clear and objective standard. And that required a lot of work, but that's an option that was always there, but we just never took it because we didn't have our plan in place. So presuming that's a correct assumption, the next thing is that we would have to, as a city, adopt that plan. And is that something that we will do as part of this process? Yes. Okay. So then when I read through the plan, I look at the findings and I look at page 34, and I would encourage you all to do that, because page 34 is the moment at which the authors of the plan, I don't know if that's you, Colin, or someone on your team, the authors of the plan wrestle with this dilemma of Goal 15 does not say you can't build anywhere in the Greenway, but it does say you should build to the maximum extent possible from the river. So one hand says, of course you can build, and the other hand says, well, but you have to move to the maximum extent possible from the river. So what we're saying as a community is the maximum extent possible for our community is top of bank plus 10 feet. So I think that's an important idea for us to understand, and the findings on page 34 really sort of get into that. So I think if I've read that right, I would encourage you all to look at those findings because it's really interesting. It was interesting to me anyway. So with that, I guess there were no questions there, sorry, for staff, except to verify that that is the path of logic that we're taking. We're going to adopt a plan, and the findings of that plan tell us how we got from development allowed to maximum extent possible from the riverfront. So I had some goal 5 coordination questions. If we're going to use goal 5 as our model, in testimony, it was suggested that we might want to require enhanced vegetative planting within the goal 5 setbacks. Is that anywhere else in the code? Do we do anything like that?
So I will take an initial attempt at responding to that. One of the things,
I guess you don't necessarily need to answer it now unless you can do it really quickly. If you can't do it really quickly, then
I'll hold back.
You can do it later. Okay.
Thanks.
So again, similar to goal 5, this idea of how we're identifying top of bank and tying that back to a surveyable situation, or I guess it's how we're identifying the 100-foot setback. Is it really the best idea to have that online on a map somewhere, and that gets every different project transposes it onto their surveys, rather than just identifying, because the top of bank is described, and asking their surveyor to say, okay, where's your top of bank? Come 100 feet from there. That seems like a better way to do it. I think Bill Close was suggesting this. And if he was right about that, that's consistent with how we treat goal 5 resources in other places. So that's something I would be interested in considering that. And then finally, goal 5, again, if I understand this right, if you have developed inside a goal 5 resource, you're allowed to continue that development to the extent of the footprint that you have. You cannot expand your footprint inside the goal 5 resource, but you can continue to have that development. And that goes for parking as well. So with these existing housing properties, I don't know if they're R1, what their zone is, but they're housing related properties. It looks like the strategy right now is to draw the line around the boundary of the property. And my question is, does it make sense, or is it even possible to use the same goal 5 criteria, which is, no, you can't develop what you already have developed inside that existing resource, and that's it. You can't expand because that, again, if I'm remembering this right, would be consistent with how we apply goal 5 rules elsewhere. So that's my question for goal 5. I have like 3 other things, but I will give my time to Commissioner Edwards, who will be more brief than I was, I'm sure.
Yeah, so I'm going to call on Commissioner Edwards. Before I do, I wanted to say, and I should have maybe said this a minute ago, I think we're definitely looking for questions from the commissioners, and we may not staff may not necessarily answer them tonight, but to the extent we have questions, it's really good to get them out there. We can have some of that stuff brought back to us when we meet again on the 22nd, when we reconvene for deliberations. So with that, I'm going to call on Commissioner Edwards.
Thanks, Chair Beeson. And Commissioner Ramey, you give me way too much credit. But in full disclosure, I have, in preparation for tonight's meeting, I have scanned through the materials, but I have not done the deep dive that I need to do prior to the deliberations. So this may be included in the deep dive of materials, but what came up for me that Louisa mentioned was kind of the difference. We have the measuring from the bank, but we also have the floodplain, we have the riparian protected areas, and I don't know where all of those intersect. And I think it would be helpful for us in our process to establish. The thing that she mentioned was, the greatest of any of those things in any particular place. And so I don't know what that would look like, but I would be curious to understand that. My understanding is that we don't develop on the 100-year floodplain. Maybe I'm wrong, but I think in some other meeting that I was in, I think that was discussed as part of buildable lands inventory or something such of that nature. So I would like clarification as to whether or not that's actually a thing. But I also think that in establishing clear and objective, I do think that you know, the greatest extent of protections that cover all of those bases, you know, I just like to see what that looks like and where that is, as well as just thinking about, I'd be curious to know what other communities maybe do when it comes to existing development, because I think that while I support not, you know, having new development pop up and you know, kind of taking advantage of a grandfathered scenario, I also would not want to see development become dilapidated because nobody further invests in it because they can't do anything with it. And then you have, like, you know, properties that really, they don't pencil to do anything else other than just to let them, you know, go to waste. So anyhow, those are just some questions that I think would be helpful for deliberations. And if it's in there, I will find it. But if not, for staff, I think it would be helpful to just kind of know where those lines intersect for me. That's it.
Thank you. Commissioner Isaacson, please.
Thank you. I have a couple things. I think we can, there's some things we can all agree on. I would hope. I think that we can all agree that what we don't want with the Greenway is a copy and paste of what's across the river on River Road. We don't want these kind of sprawling apartment complexes that are privately owned that take away from basically what is a treasure for the River Road area and the city. And I don't know that what is being proposed, even in its extreme hyperbole, gets there. But I also don't think that we have a really good, clean idea for what the hyperbole could be at its maximum. So what would be really nice is in our deliberations, if we had a map that said, here's the total number of lots and where those lots are, of the impacted areas, if all of it was developed. If there was a magic wand that the developers had to come in here and develop every single available lot, here's the spaces where it would impact, so that the community has an idea for, is this going to affect my neighborhood? Is this going to affect my next door neighbors? Is this going to affect me? When I walk on the bike path, am I going to have to walk in between abutting giant apartment complexes, which I don't think is on the periphery here. But the other, one of our community members talked about her 2.888 acres, and she had a list of questions there, and it sounded as though they weren't really questions that she was asking about her property, but more so in general. So is this something that could be done? And I think that those are really good to come back with some answers with. Could it on that particular property create 72 units, or go from her 72 to 125 with a 42-foot high building, a 5 foot from the fence? What about the tree canopy? I think those are the questions that a lot of folks have. And if we come back with in the public hearing, or early deliberations rather, with those answers, then we can kind of layer that on top of, here are the facts of what could be done to a property. Here are all the properties that it could actually happen to, so that we can have a little bit tampered down hyperbole and have a little bit better idea for what the impact of this is, so that we can better deliberate amongst ourselves as commissioners.
Okay, thank you. I have a question. Yes, it's along the lines, I think, of Commissioner Isaacson's first question. I'm gonna, as I went through all the material, I guess I'm curious. I just kind of the way I'm wired, I'm trying to get a little perspective here in terms of what this is. When I look at the extent of the Willamette Greenway within the urban growth boundary, and I look at it on both sides of the river, and I was trying to examine the maps that we got. They were very good maps, but I found myself kind of laboring to find lot lines here and there. I guess my kind of my basic question, I'm curious. We know that 88% of that total acreage inside the Greenway is public. It's what I've got in my notes, and leaves 12% of it in private, what I'm calling private ownership. So I'm curious, what share of that is residential? I guess I'm kind of specifically, as Commissioner Isaacson was saying, I'm kind of curious where is that residential? I can kind of define it. I can kind of see it a bit, along some of the areas, but I'd like to know a little bit more about maybe how many residential lots there are inside the Willamette Greenway, how many residential lots there are in the Greenway that are developed. And even a little more specifically, I was listening carefully and I tried to read the material carefully. Do we have right now anywhere inside the proposed setback, taking them as you're proposing them now, the 100-foot setback, and then the others where there's a 35-foot or whatever it is in some of the special areas, do we have any residential property and or developed property inside the setback at this point? I mean, I think I was hearing no, and then I think I was hearing maybe, and I'm just not sure. So I'll just leave that out there, I guess, as a question that maybe we can talk about when we reconvene and I can get a little perspective. So with that, I'm gonna turn it to Commissioner Ramey.
Well, thank you. Thank you for indulging me. I think I can get through all my questions in this last burst. There's a series of questions about the dimensions that are included in the proposal and the proposed changes. And in much the same as Commissioner Taylor might have said, where did this come from? Let's be sure they're not just arbitrary, that they're based on something. The building that can only be 80 feet long, is that somewhere else in the code, or is that new to this proposal? The 500 feet from public access points, does that mimic the dimension of a block face? Is that how far someone could walk reasonably? And then the 10-foot additional buffer, see, now what was it? It was a landscape buffer maybe, but anyway, that extra 10-foot thing, where did the 10 feet come from? Is that based on ecological whatever, or I think it's 7 feet other places in the code. So those are sort of my dimensional questions, just to being sure that those come somewhere else in the code, or that there's some other basis why we got to them. And then about that extra 10-foot, I don't think I heard this, and I don't think I read this, but is it only native plants in that 10-foot, or is it that there can only, you're saying yes? Okay. And then if you're planting anything in the buffer itself, that's obviously native plants. And then you wouldn't be allowed, I think somebody said, well, let's be sure we don't create a paved access road. Well, you can't create a paved access road across a Goal 5 resource, but maybe I'm wrong about that. So some verification of what, if that would even be possible. So the only other thing I have, well, two things, both from Mr. Farrington's testimony. One was about the fencing. Do we have standards for fencing elsewhere in the code? Semi-transparent fence, what does that mean? I think he mentioned there would be a ban on cyclone fencing, and do we do that elsewhere in the code, or is it something new for us? So some more explanation of where that came from. And then finally, I think he points out a dilemma in the Walnut node, Walnut special use area, and I'm aware of that you can't have, I don't think you can have parking between the development and the right of way, but yet you could also then not have parking between the development and the buffer. So then you couldn't have parking unless you dedicated side of your lot to parking, and maybe that's okay. But some explanation of, is Walnut Station the only place where that happens? And if you dig into that code, is there a workaround that he and other developers could use within that zoning code? So that was it. Thank you.
Okay, do we have anything else? Any other questions from commissioners? And I guess Gabe and everyone else, is there anything else that the staff has that you want to comment on?
At this point, I'd like to thank the commissioners. These are excellent questions, and we intend to dive a little deeper and come back with more information. I think that we will have answers to most of those, if not all, and we'll look forward to the discussion or deliberations meeting.
Commissioner Isaacson.
I left one thing off my list. I'll just throw this out there. This is the second time this has come up. It's in our public hearings is the amount of notice or the methods by which we're notifying the public. I think it's adequate. I'm sure that obviously a lot of people here would as well. I think it would be good is even if we were to put out as part of our community outreach, not a new method, but to ask the public what method they would want in addition to what we're doing. And if there's something that makes sense, that is cost feasible and not, mailing half the city a notice, but if there's something that we're missing and that we can be better at and add to our best practices, then let's do it, right? And it would allow us to kind of take that, I don't want to use the word objection, but take the idea or like the presumption that we're just kind of doing a formality and that we're not really actively trying to get engaged with the public, because I know I have had lots of conversations with my neighborhood association, which I'm a part of, about this. This is top of mind for a lot of folks and a lot of people know about it. And so when you're kind of siloed into thinking, well, all these folks know about it, so everyone else knows about it. And then we have someone like today who came on, said, I found out about it from a notice that was in the yard as I was running on the bike path and rushed in here to give comment. I think that's great and commendable. But how many other people who would be offering some very good comments for us don't know about it? And if we can find some new way, especially in the new Zoom world that we're living in, to add some additional method of notifying them, I think that is worth exploring. And if we don't do it from the position of we're going to tell the public this is how we're going to communicate with you, but rather open it up and say, how would you want us to communicate with you? Then I think that changes the dynamic from hierarchical down to organic up.
Thank you. Jeff.
Thank you. I just want to let everyone, thank you for the really good questions. And we've got 2 weeks here until deliberations. And so as you dive deeper into these code amendments, I encourage you to reach out to Gabe and I and be your best point of contact to forward any other questions. And then we can make sure to include those answers as part of our deliberations process and make sure you get all those questions answered moving forward. So.
Thank you. Thanks very much. Okay. I'm not seeing any other hands raised. Okay. So I think what I'd like to do is kind of close off on the discussion portion of this. Again, I want to thank everyone who joined us tonight and who spoke to us and who offered testimony. We appreciate it. We will be back. We will reconvene on this on March 22nd, and we're going to begin deliberations on this item. And as we've mentioned, I'll mention it again, any written testimony. So we have the record open until 5 p.m. on March 15th. Any written testimony that's provided by 5 o'clock on March 15th will come to the Planning Commission for our deliberations. And then any testimony that's submitted after that time is going to be provided directly to the City Council. So it will still get in there. So with that, I think we've reached the end of this process tonight, and I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to close the meeting. I'm going to adjourn this meeting of the Planning Commission.